The Northwest Indian War, a struggle for survival and sovereignty. The frontier was burning. The years following the American Revolution were meant to be a time of nation-building for the young United States, but in the Ohio Valley and beyond, a different kind of war was raging. It was a war not fought for independence from a foreign king, but for survival against an encroaching tide of settlers and soldiers. The Northwest Indian War, which lasted from 1785 to 1795, was a brutal and desperate struggle waged between the newly formed United States and a powerful alliance of Native American tribes, known as the Western Confederacy. It was a battle for land, identity, and the right to exist in a rapidly changing world. The storm on the horizon. The ink on the Treaty of Paris had barely dried before settlers poured westward, seeking fertile farmland in the Ohio Valley. To the native tribes who had called this land home for centuries, the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and others, this wave of settlers was an existential threat. The British, though having officially ceded control of the region, continued to support the native resistance, providing weapons and supplies to their former allies in an effort to keep the American expansion in check. At the heart of this growing storm stood Chief Little Turtle of the Miami, Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, and Buckongahelas of the Delaware. These leaders, recognizing the common threat, set aside intertribal rivalries and formed the Western Confederacy, a rare and powerful alliance of warriors determined to resist the American advance. A war of blood and betrayal. The war began in earnest with a series of decisive victories for the native warriors. The American military, untested and overconfident, underestimated the strength and tactics of the Western Confederacy. In 1790, General Josiah Harmar led a force of over 1,400 troops into the Ohio Territory, seeking to crush the resistance. Instead, his army was ambushed and annihilated by a much smaller native force, marking the first major defeat of the war. The following year, General Arthur St. Clair led an even larger force of 2,000 men deep into native territory. What followed was one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. On the morning of November 4, 1791, near the banks of the Wabash River, St. Clair's army was ambushed by warriors under the command of Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. The battle was a slaughter. Over 900 American soldiers were killed or wounded, an 80% casualty rate that remains the worst defeat ever suffered by the U.S. Army against native forces. St. Clair barely escaped with his life, and the American frontier was left vulnerable. Despite these staggering losses, the United States refused to abandon its expansionist ambitions. President George Washington, recognizing the dire situation, turned to a new military leader, General Mad Anthony Wayne. Unlike his predecessors, Wayne took his time, drilling his soldiers into a disciplined force capable of matching the native warriors in battle. The final stand at Fallen Timbers. By 1794, the tide of war had begun to shift. Wayne's newly trained Legion of the United States moved methodically through the Ohio Valley, building forts and cutting off supply lines. The final and most decisive confrontation came on August 20, 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The native forces, weakened by a lack of British support and dwindling resources, made a desperate stand against Wayne's army. Despite their fierce resistance, the native warriors were ultimately defeated. After the battle, Wayne burned native villages and destroyed food supplies, effectively ending large-scale resistance. With no aid forthcoming from the British, the leaders of the Western Confederacy were forced to negotiate. The war came to an official end with the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which saw the native tribes cede vast amounts of their land in exchange for peace. Legacy of the war. Though the Northwest Indian War ended in a native defeat, it proved that indigenous resistance was a force to be reckoned with. The sacrifices made by warriors like Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and Buckongahelas ensured that their people's struggle for sovereignty would not be forgotten. These leaders had united their tribes under a common cause, defending their lands, their traditions, and their very existence. The war demonstrated that native resistance was not simply an obstacle to be brushed aside, but a fundamental part of the American frontier's history, one that would continue for generations to come. The war also set a precedent for the treatment of Native nations by the U.S. government. In its wake, the United States increasingly relied on a cycle of treaties, many of which were later broken, as a means of acquiring indigenous lands while maintaining a facade of diplomacy. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 was one such example. It forced Native nations to relinquish vast territories in present-day Ohio, Indiana, and beyond, further diminishing their autonomy. Yet, even in their forced concessions, the Native leaders who signed the treaty understood that their fight was far from over. While they had lost this battle, they would continue resisting, adapting their strategies to meet the changing world. The repercussions of the Northwest Indian War rippled far beyond the immediate loss of land. It signaled a shift in American policy toward Native nations, setting the stage for future conflicts such as Tecumseh's War, the Black Hawk War, and eventually the Trail of Tears. The war also reinforced the British tendency to support Native resistance in order to counterbalance American expansion, a strategy that played a role in the War of 1812. Native leaders like Little Turtle, who later advocated for peace and adaptation, and Tecumseh, who sought to build a renewed pan-tribal confederacy, carried forward the lessons of this struggle into future generations. For the United States, the war had profound consequences as well. The shocking defeats at the hands of the Western Confederacy, especially St. Clair's defeat, which remains one of the worst losses in American military history, forced the young nation to reevaluate its military strategies. The lessons learned from this conflict led to the creation of a more disciplined and professional standing army under General Anthony Wayne. His success at the Battle of Fallen Timbers helped establish a military presence in the Ohio Valley that would continue to grow, further reinforcing American expansionism and westward settlement. But despite their ultimate defeat, the indigenous warriors who fought in the Northwest Indian War left behind an enduring legacy. Their courage and sacrifice became symbols of resistance, inspiring future generations of Native leaders and warriors. The memory of their struggle was passed down through oral traditions, stories of valor and loss woven into the fabric of their cultures. Even as the United States continued to push westward, Native nations remained determined to hold on to their identities, their traditions, and whatever lands they could still call their own. The frontier was forever changed, not just in its geography, but in its spirit. The battles fought, the lives lost, and the dreams of both settlers and Native peoples clashed on this contested ground. The blood spilled in the forests of the Ohio Valley soaked into the earth, binding the past to the present. The legacy of those who fought in the Northwest Indian War is not confined to history books. It is alive in the descendants of those who resisted, in the lands they sought to protect, and in the continued struggle for indigenous rights and recognition in modern America. The war may have ended on paper, but its echoes still resonate. In every debate over land rights, in every acknowledgement of broken treaties, and in every indigenous community that continues to thrive against all odds, the spirit of the warriors who fought in the Northwest Indian War endures. If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and become a part of our community. Here, you will find historical wars, inspiring stories, and unique content based on real events. If you want to see more engaging and fact-based stories, hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest videos instantly. Your support means the world to us. Leave a comment and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. Raising hands fire, bell subscribe, share, and help us bring these incredible stories to the world.